In this lecture, we will talk about the art process of printmaking and all the different types of printmaking. First of all, printmaking is very unique in that it's a type of two-dimensional art where you make multiple copies of the art, but every single one is considered to be a work of art. Sometimes we also call prints impressions, and this has been around since the 9th century, but didn't become popular in Europe until the Renaissance because we didn't have paper until then. So why would artists use printmaking? A lot of people see it more as a challenge because you have to create a block or a plate that you're going to ink up and print. And that can be very time consuming. A lot of the printmaking process, you also get a reverse image. So you have to do a lot of planning ahead. But the advantages are there's so many of them. One, it has its own unique look. It's very expressive. Also, when you do printmaking, if you do a print, if you carve a plate and then you print it 200 times, you can display that in 200 different places, and it's all considered to be original work. And again, this is all done by hand, not printed on a computer or anything like that. Not that that's not art as well, but some people take photographs of art and then they print those, and that's what's called a reproduction. So it's not technically printmaking. All right. Prints are usually also smaller, and they have a different look. And sometimes people can sell them for less, and they can make more money because if you have, like, let's say, one painting that's the only one, and it's really big or something, you would probably charge a whole lot of money for that because if you once you sell it, that's kind of it. But if you do like an edition of 1,000 prints, you have a lot of them, so you probably would sell them for less than you would your painting. And since they're less expensive, more people may actually purchase it. This is some of the vocabulary that you need to know. So again, what we're talking about is original printmaking, and that's where every print is an original work of art, even though there may be more than one of them. Whenever you see like the posters at the store, or sometimes artists will like do a painting and then they'll sell prints of the painting. But what they mean is they took a photo of it and then they printed it on their computer, and that's what they're selling you. So they're actually selling you a reproduction of a painting. It's not an actual print, okay? An artist proof, that is where whenever you're carving, let's say, into a piece of wood, and you're not sure if it looks good yet, sometimes you can print and ink it up and then print it to see what it looks like. And that's what we would call an artist proof. Like, it's like different satisfactory stages during the process. And then in addition, that's a collection of prints that are all exactly the same. And so usually once you have your plate or your block that's been carved or etched or whatever it is that you do to it, then you will decide what type of paper you want to use and how many that you're going to print from it. And usually artists will do several hundred because they want to get as much from it as they can. And so they may print 500, and then a lot of times they will destroy the block or the plate afterwards so that nobody can ever make more if they were ever to find them in the future. So these are the 5 categories of printmaking: relief printmaking, intaglio, lithographs, screen prints, and monoprints or monotypes. So relief printmaking, it basically means that you carve away what you don't want to print, and it is like making your own stamp in a way, and it is subtractive. So with types of relief printmaking, people carve into wood, linoleum, which is kind of like a rubbery clay-like surface. They will carve into stamps. They can ink up anything that's rough, like a tire, or even, like you see here, a picture of a fish. And then you print it on paper, kind of like a stamp. And you use a roller, which is called a brayer, to roll the ink on. And so here you can see the artist has carved their plate, and that little red tool with the little point on the end, that's what you would use to carve the tool. And you put it in this little hook called a bench hook that you carve into it, and then you ink it up. You roll the ink on instead of painting it on. That way it's flat and even, and then you print it onto paper. So these are a few artists that use printmaking. The first few did woodcuts, And you can see how expressive and unique looking. A lot of times people only use black and white for printmaking just because it has a really graphic quality, but you could also use color inks as well, and you can even use more than one color if you want to. But usually with woodcuts, you can kind of see the grain of the wood as well. Kata Kolvitz, we've talked about her before. This was that self-portrait that I told you guys about that just had such a heartbreaking feel to it. And again, most of her artwork was about the hardships of war and what it was like being a mother in war times when there wasn't equality. So these are several of hers. So whenever you look at these, just think the original piece of wood, she would have carved out all the areas that are white, and then anywhere that's black, that's where the ink would have been rolled on and printed to the paper. But they're very expressive, and I love doing printmaking. I'm a painter, but I took just as many printmaking classes in college too, and so I kind of go back and forth between the two, and usually when I have an exhibit, I'll have exhibits of paintings and prints at the same time. So you can always do more than one thing as an artist. So there are just several more of hers. Now, Elizabeth Catlett, she is a world famous printmaker, and if you look back at the sculpture lecture, you'll see some of her wooden sculptures. But she also liked to do printmaking with linoleum, and linoleum is like a clay-like substance that we make our floor tiles with, and you can carve into them and then ink them up. And because it's so soft, it allows you to carve a bunch of different directions. And Elizabeth Catlett created several prints during the civil rights movements to raise more attention about some of the things that were happening. And that's another advantage to printmaking, is that because you can make multiples, if you want to make propaganda to raise awareness, it's a great process to do that. So these are some of her pieces. They're really beautiful, very intricate carving. And I've seen this one in person. It's breathtaking. Now, you may wonder how she has the green and the brown as well. And those could be another plate that she carved away everything except for those areas for that color. And then she may have just rolled green on that area and brown on the other area and then printed that on the paper and then printed the black on top of it. Or she could have cut out pieces of paper that were that same size and then glued those down to the paper and then printed on top of it. And that's a process called Chencole. But these are some more of her pieces, and I really love when artists use their artwork as their voice about their feelings about different movements that are happening in the world to raise awareness. So these are just some more of her pieces. This one's really sad and tragic, but the way she used all these hatching lines, it brings up all this energy, and it almost makes you feel as the viewer like you're walking up to this horrific, violent act happening, and it makes you want to do something to stop it. Now, the second process is called intaglio, and that is the process, it's the opposite of relief printmaking. So instead of carving away what you don't want to print, what you carve away, you then put the ink down into the crevices. And so for this, usually um, the artist will use metal plates of zinc or copper, and then they'll kind of scratch into the surface or use acid to etch the lines away. So there's three different intaglio processes: engraving, dry point, and etching. And you get two colors with this process, because you can put one color down into the grooves and then another area on top of the flat plate. So it's like combining intaglio and relief together. And we call that viscosity printmaking. And then engraving means like using metal to carve into the metal burren to carve into the plates, kind of like we get our jewelry etched. And then the ink would be rubbed into the little grooves. And then dry point is a process where you use the stylus that has a diamond on the end of it to scratch the surface of the plate, and it leaves these little burrs, so it gives you really blurry lines. And some people just like that look. And then etching is using acid. So you would cover your metal plate with this like tar like substance called asphaltum. And then you would draw through the tar kind of like a scratch board. And whatever you scratch away, it exposes the metal. And then you put it into a bath of acid, usually hydrochloric acid that's been slightly diluted. and the acid actually eats away the lines. Then you wash it off, rub the ink down into the crevices, and then you can print it. And these are some other processes that you can, some vocabulary that you needed to know where you can create different effects with intaglio. So here you see someone, they've rubbed the ink all over their metal plate, and then they're buffing the excess ink off of the surface to get back down to the shiny metal. And then you put the paper on top and run it through a printmaking press, and all you have are just the fine lines and stuff that you wanted on there. It's a little bit harder, and I took several classes of it, and it takes a while to kind of master it. If you're wanting to do printmaking, you might want to start with relief printmaking first before you kind of get the hang of it before you move on to the intaglio process. Now, Albert Dürer was a artist that during the Renaissance he started doing intaglio printmaking, and some people they compare him to the Leonardo da Vinci of Germany during the Renaissance because he was really skillful and he did a bunch of different things, kind of like Da Vinci. But he mostly illustrated different biblical stories, and these were all intaglio processes. So again, this is the 1500s, and you can see how impressive he was able to do this with printmaking, which was brand new. Like I said, it wasn't until the Renaissance when paper was being made in Europe, and so that's when printmaking became popular in that area. And one of the unique things about Albert Dürer is a lot of the other Renaissance artists, you didn't see them sign their name on the front of their art, but in all of his printmaking, you can see that he did. These are just a few more examples of his intaglio print, and this one I thought was really cool. It's obviously not religious, but it's of a rhinoceros. And he had never seen a rhinoceros before. He had just read about what they look like. And so he created this whole print from his imagination and descriptions of words. If you want to see more of his work, you can follow the link here. Another artist that used engraving and intaglio methods was Jose Guadalupe Posada, and he worked as an illustrator for different periodicals, and he would make printmaking plates because before we had photography, if we had images in newspapers or magazines, they were done in printmaking methods. And that's another thing a lot of people don't realize is before photography, we had to hand make all the images that we had in our newspapers and magazines and things of that nature. Most of Jose's artwork dealt with Day of the Dead or El Dia de los Muertos and the celebration of life. And there's kind of a whimsical quality, even though there is kind of the morbid skeleton. But in his culture, this was a time of celebration of all those who had passed. And the skeleton doesn't necessarily have the same dark connotations that maybe it does in other parts of the world. He also would do, like I said, illustrations for the museums, I mean, for the newspapers and periodicals. And so here we can see, I imagine him making this as a to go with the story about the execution of some rebels. And these are just some more of his prints. I really enjoy his work quite a bit. As we talked about before in the painting chapter, William Blake used watercolor to hand color his prints. And so he used etching. And these are some of his plates without the color, some of his prints without the color. And you can see the really beautiful gradation and the fun effects he was able to get through using etching. This artist, Veja Clemmings, she uses that process that was called dry point intaglio, where she uses that little tiny tool to scratch the metal plate and it creates a fuzzy effect. And here you see her signing a stack of an edition of one of her pieces. And you can see there's probably over 100 pieces of paper stacked here, and she has to sign each one exactly the same way because that's what you do with an edition. But these are some of her prints. This is not a photograph. This is an intaglio print made with the dry point process. So anywhere you see the black, that's where she scratched the surface of the plate. And the white area, that's the part of the plate that she left untouched. So this would have been very time consuming and very meticulously done. And this is another one she did with the ocean. And so again, all the gray and black areas, she would have scratched the metal plate with that stylus, and then the ink goes into those areas that are rough, and it prints this beautiful, what almost looks like a photo, but it's a print. Now, lithography is a little different. The prefix litho actually means stone, and so you use a flat piece of marble, and it involves water and oil resistance. And there are these crayons, or sometimes it comes in a liquid form as well, where you draw on the surface of the marble slab with these greasy crayons, and then you roll ink over it. And the ink is also is oil based, and the ink will only stick to wherever those greasy marks are. So this is a very fast process, and it can also look a lot more like a drawing or painting. And this is how a lot of posters and advertisements were made before we had computers. And so here's a lithography press, and you can see the marble slab that they're working on. And Kata Kovacs that we talked about before, she also did lithographs. And you can see this is one, and it almost looks like a charcoal drawing. And it's a lot softer than her woodcuts that we saw previously. And this is just another one that you can see here, same subject matter. Henri Lautrec, he was an artist that loved doing these lithographs, and he also loved the party lifestyle. So he lived in Paris, and he loved going to all the dance halls and the bars, and that's how he made a living. Is he would make advertisements with lithography for a lot of these celebrations that he liked to go to. And you've probably seen his art before. If you've ever seen the movie Moulin Rouge with Nicole Kidman and Ewan McGregor, the character in it that John Leguizamo plays is actually supposed to be Lautrec. If you've seen it, it's a really good movie. But he loved partying, and he loved to use his art as a way to advertise for those different performances. He was known to be very short, because there was rumors that there was some incest in his family that gave him a genetic disorder. But he became very successful in a short amount of time. He was highly influenced by Japanese art. A lot of people don't know this, but in the 1800s, Japan's borders opened, and for the first time, their artwork was traveling all over the world. And whenever the artist and the Impressionist era saw it, it really influenced their color choice, their patterns, their compositions, and you can see a lot of that Japanese influence in his lithographs. But here we see an advertisement for the Moulin Rouge, and then more of his different posters that he would make. This was one of his friends. Her name was Jane April, and she was a dancer and performer and singer. And she helped make him famous as an artist by telling all of her clients about him. And he helped make her famous by making posters for her different performances. So here we see this is for an opera that she was in, and then this is for a dance number that she was performing in. And very creative compositions. Again, a lot of that came from the Japanese influence. But here we have one of the bows from the instruments in the orchestra pit making the border of the print. And I threw this in. This is one of his lithographs, but it's actually of the lithograph process. And you can see the printmaker printing the posters. And if you think back to just the few slides before, you can see that process has not changed much at all. It looks almost exactly like what we see here. The fourth process that we'll talk about is what's called serigraphy or screen printing. And this is the only process that you do not get a reverse image. And so it's very unique. This is how a lot of our t-shirts and patterns are made on our clothing and other fabrics. You basically make a stencil where you take a screen that can be made of nylon or silk, or I've even seen people use other types of very thin fabric, and you basically paint something on it to seal part of the area, and then you don't seal the area that you want the ink to go through. And then by using a squeegee, you squeegee over that onto the paper or fabric, and that pushes the ink through, making the image that you want. Often, when you go to the retail stores, you'll see them advertise T-shirts, and they'll call them screen tees, and that's because they were probably made with the screen printing process. There are machines that do this now, but back in the day, this was all done by hand. There's even solutions that you can add to the screen and then expose it to a negative from a photograph, and it will make that image that you can use as a screen. And so that's how we're able to get photorealistic imagery on a lot of our clothing. And so here's just some diagrams kind of explaining that process. Andy Warhol, a lot of people call him one of the first pop artists. He was obsessed with celebrity life. He went to school to be a graphic designer and illustrator, and that's how he got his start, was designing shoe ads and clothing ads and doing comics for newspapers. And he got into a kind of wealthy crowd. He came from a small farm town family, and he became friends with some rich people in New York, and they started buying his art, and the next thing you know, he was a world famous artist. But part of why he was celebrated was because of his pieces involving pop culture. And really, he thought that people had replaced religion with worshiping pop culture. And pop art was really about that influence of pop culture, consumerism, all of these things that kind of consume our lives. And that's what he was trying to make. The point he was trying to make. He also started Interview Magazine, the magazine that interviews up and coming stars. And he also had a band called the Velvet Underground. He did filmmaking, he wrote books, he published things for other people that weren't famous enough to get the attention. So he was one of the first ghostwriters as well. And he did a lot of other very controversial things that you may have heard about. There are several movies about his life, and some people say that no one will ever really know who he was because he lived so many different kind of versions of his life, and he was a very mysterious person, almost like a celebrity himself. But he became very, very successful, becoming a millionaire during his lifetime, which is not something that very many visual artists are able to do during their lifetime. His obsession with Marilyn Monroe came after her death. He noticed that after she passed away, that people went crazy. They were upset, so upset, people quit their jobs to drive across the country to try to attend her funeral and things like that. And so he took a movie still from one of her movies called Niagara, and he made a silkscreen of it, and he would reproduce that over and over onto canvas to pay tribute to her, but also to kind of show how, in a way, these celebrities kind of become idols to people in some ways. So here, this piece was called Maryland Diptych, and we talked about diptychs and triptychs before in this class, and they would have been originally put on altars in churches back in the day. So this was kind of him poking fun that celebrities had kind of replaced the religious icons that we would put on altars. He was known for doing a lot of celebrity portraits, but also consume regular products that we could find at the grocery store. He loved Coca-Cola and he loved Campbell's soup, and so he made prints of those things. And you would think how he could get away with that, and it's because the companies didn't care, because it was basically free advertising for them. He would sell these prints for thousands of dollars, where you could buy, the real product for just, a couple of bucks. So when people would ask him, well, why do you make art of soup cans or art of Coke bottles? And he would be like, well, I really like soup. So he had kind of a sense of humor, and there was a sense of irony about a lot of his work. But because this process is fairly simple, and he was mass producing pop culture images, a lot of people started doing it as well. And a lot of people have discovered that they actually don't own a Warhol, that they own a copy that someone else had made of his work. Now, the last category is what's called monotypes or monoprint, and that's where artists don't make an edition that's all the same, that they make each print slightly different. So that's what a monoprint is. So let's say you carve a piece of linoleum or wood, but you decide that every time you print it, you're going to use a different type of paper, or maybe you'll use a different color ink. Those would be monoprints because they could be repeated, but they're not the same. Monotypes is where people will sometimes, like you see in the images here, people will take the printmaking inks and they'll paint on glass or plexiglass, and then they'll put paper on it and print it to the paper. So it's just a different way of making a unique, one-of-a-kind print. And nowadays, with all the technology we have, even though printmaking has stayed pretty traditional, there's all sorts of digital ways that people can do some of these things with computers and 3D printers and even wood carvers that can connect to computers to do it for you.